Section 6. Science Communication, How Narratives Are Formed. Despite everything we've talked about up to this point, the rampant fraud and questionable philosophical paradigms, the scientific institution still manages a strong grasp on the social mind. News media, entertainment, health, and, of course, academia all continue to dance to its tune. So, how can this narrative control be accomplished functionally? Well, just like we have the common saying, our story of history is determined by the winners, we could also say that scientific facts are determined by the winners as well. Winners in this context refers to those who have achieved high status positions within the social engineering apparatus. As we've learned from a study of history and basic human nature, it turns out that once certain individuals achieve such positions of status, one of the first orders of business is to surround themselves with others who are loyal to them and/or have a similar outlook on things. This is the progenitor of criminal conspiracies across all institutions. So by my read, it's far more unfathomable to believe that this wouldn't happen in the sciences than that it would, considering the sway that they hold over the public mind. Once this power hierarchy has been established, there are various methods that can be rolled out to manipulate how this institution presents itself. Most of these methods involve controlling the production and distribution of scientific literature and communications, so we'll explore some of those specifics in this section. The first, quite simple method is to hide inconvenient conclusions. It's been pointed out by various whistleblowers that certain research papers will be suppressed or rejected not because of some flawed methodology within the study, but rather because the author's results and conclusions upset the apple cart in one way or another. This is usually the case in fields whose research findings carry a lot of weight in the public sphere at large, including, but not limited to, climate change, gender dynamics, human evolution, and vaccination protocols. Even if contradictory research papers do get accepted into a journal, they're not likely to be well disseminated to the public through media outlets or included in your average run-of-the-mill biology curriculum. Again, it's the public narrative that matters. This suppression can also take the form of censoring raw data, even in circumstances where the paper based on them does end up being published. This makes it so that other researchers can't go in to verify that conclusions match the numbers. What's more is that a vast amount of science is funded publicly, aka through taxes. This then means that educational institutions have the ability to keep from the public the raw results of research that they themselves paid for. There are even some reported cases where researchers have been threatened with defamation lawsuits if they divulge their data, as a form of intimidation. And I really wish I could say such things weren't occurring, folks, but the evidence that they have been and continue to be seems to keep piling up. On the flip side of this hiding of contradictory evidence, there are cases where just the opposite happens. Studies with questionable methods and conclusions may be accepted based solely on the fact that they do uphold the popular narrative. We need look no further than 2020 and 2021, when numerous rush studies started coming out about the benefits of mask wearing, despite previous evidence which showed that they had at best a non-significant effect towards preventing respiratory illness. In other cases, no effect was detected, or even sometimes a worsening effect. This was quickly followed by others that claimed to show the overwhelming effectiveness of the new vaccines that were then being rolled out, despite there being absolutely no way to determine that with any proper clinical or scientific rigor at the time. Very often, though, in cases like these, such studies will eventually be retracted from the journals. But this really amounts to a token gesture since their impact on the public's perception will have already been made. In many cases, the cameras won't be rolling when this happens, and the game can continue. As a matter of fact, very recently, the year 2023 set a record for the highest number of retracted papers across all scientific journals, with some sources claiming over 10,000 of these. A fact which received very little coverage outside of some niche publications that your average Joe isn't even going to notice. And as a matter of fact, according to Retraction Watch, a team of researchers who catalog these occurrences and whose website I highly recommend having saved for reference and perusal, every year since 2018 has shown a steady increase in the number of retractions, meaning this record was broken annually over the course of 5 years. They've also calculated an overall average 23% increase in retractions since 2013. I think it's important to note here that although some of the aforementioned reporting stated that it was over 10,000 papers being retracted in 2023, this graph that Retraction Watch published shows 9,619, which is of course a bit less. I'm not sure what caused this discrepancy, if it was just a matter of rounding and then exaggerating by secondary outlets, but felt it was worth mentioning. Either way, though, it's a huge number, and this trend should be alarming to anyone. I'm recording this now in late 2025 and haven't yet found conclusive data regarding this year or previous, but if these numbers remain accurate and unabated, we might infer this record has likely been broken again twice. We'll have to wait and see, but I won't be too surprised if this hypothesis pans out. Combine all of this with the extremely fast pace at which new studies are performed via publication inflation, as discussed previously, and the lack of confirmation through replication, a la the replication crisis, also discussed previously, and it becomes difficult even for the foremost experts in a field, let alone the public at large, to keep track of which claims are scientifically valid and which aren't. You might also find cases of the organizations that supply grants refusing to provide funding to labs who seem to be stepping out of bounds. If you're a researcher who writes up a grant proposal to research the validity of, let's just say, the out-of-Africa theory of human origins or the mainstream climate change narrative, you'd likely run into the issue of many grant foundations rejecting you solely on the basis that they don't like what you're implying. And that's not to say this kind of research isn't out there being done, but there are these unnecessary hurdles being thrown in people's way, it seems. This is all exacerbated by the fact that many of their peers might be invested in maintaining a certain status quo, for many of the same reasons already stated. And if they've staked their entire careers on certain assumptions being true, then they're not going to want some other upstart researchers coming along and showing their careers to be rested on shoddy foundations. It's not a good look. And if researchers make a name for themselves as detractors from the politically correct version of the narrative, they risk a permanent smudge on their reputations, which could translate to a loss of livelihood. So many will simply toe the line or stay hushed up about what they've observed out of a sense of security. As they say, the nail that sticks out gets the hammer. And it's common for apologists to make the claim that this is an overblown statement because any scientist in their right mind would actually want to upset the apple cart because that would make their career. So publishing conclusive evidence that says, for example, the Big Bang is impossible or highly unlikely would see them skyrocketing to fame and fortune. Unfortunately for this argument, we've seen that it's far more likely for their names to be dragged through the mud and their work hinterlanded into obscurity. This, I think, is a naive artifact from a time when the institutions might have been looked at as a more legitimate force for truth. Now this is no longer the case. As it stands, the paradigm of materialist positivism isn't built on any serious, stringent, or objective standards, but on blind faith in a quasi-religious canon handed down from on high by this new priest class, further proselytized by sophomoric acolyte students and self-appointed intellectuals. And of course, we should mention that the scientific narrative for your average person isn't even coming by way of systematic, detail-oriented education or the reading of published articles, but by way of scripted sound bites from secondary downstream sources. Television news networks and social media feeds can deliver exactly the message required by the management, and it's become all too common for them to season the message with scientific phrases in order to make it sell that much better to the unthinking masses. So that's it for this one, guys. I know it was short. The next session will be a bit longer and address the motivations for these deceptive practices. So I will see you there.